Snow crunched under heavy paws as a massive beast dropped a shivering, crying infant on a frost-covered doorstep. Githa Morales opened her heavy oak door to find not a monster, but a desperate plea. One child became 2, then 5. She never turned them away, completely unaware whose heirs she was raising. Frost clung to the thatched roof of Githa Morales's isolated cottage deep in the harsh winter of 1432. Living on the unforgiving outskirts of the village of Oak Haven, the young widow was no stranger to isolation. Her husband, a humble blacksmith named Thomas, had succumbed to the sweating sickness 3 years prior, leaving her with a meager garden, a flock of stubborn goats, and a silence that deafened her every evening. That silence shattered on a Tuesday night. A rhythmic, frantic scratching at her reinforced door pulled Githa from her uneasy slumber by the hearth. Grasping the heavy iron poker Thomas had forged, she unlatched the deadbolt, expecting a starving scavenger. Instead, she found a massive silver-furred wolf standing on her porch. In its formidable jaws, it held a bundle of woven wool. Githa froze, her knuckles turning white around the iron poker. The beast did not attack. It gently lowered the bundle onto the freezing wood, took 3 deliberate steps backward, and locked its piercing amber eyes with hers. It let out a low, mournful whine, turned, and vanished into the treeline. Hesitantly, Githa stepped out into the biting cold. The bundle was squirming. Pulling back the folds of wool, she gasped. Wrapped inside was an infant, no older than 6 months, with a mop of dark hair and striking, luminescent golden eyes. "Lord have mercy," she whispered, quickly bringing the freezing child inside. This was merely the beginning. Githa assumed it was a bizarre, terrifying anomaly. However, exactly 3 nights later, another wolf arrived. This one possessed a dark russet coat and dragged a woven basket by its teeth. Inside sat a terrified toddler, perhaps 3 years of age, clutching a carved wooden toy. Over the next fortnight, the deliveries continued until Githa's tiny home was bursting with life. She documented the children in her late husband's ledger to keep her sanity intact. Tobias, the 3-year-old boy fiercely protective of the others, refused to sleep indoors and preferred the cold floor near the hearth. Beatrice and William, 2-year-old twins with matching golden eyes, possessed an unnatural strength that allowed them to easily rip the heavy oak doors off her cupboards. Clara, the original infant, required constant goat's milk and possessed unusually sharp canines for a babe. John, a silent 4-year-old, arrived with terrible slashing wounds across his back, requiring Githa's utmost skill in herbal medicine to survive. Caring for 5 children was a monumental task for a single widow. Githa exhausted her winter supplies within a week. She was forced to make daily trips into Oak Haven, pulling a wooden sled to purchase excess grain, heavy wool, and an absurd amount of salted meat. Her sudden massive purchases didn't go unnoticed. Lord Canon Jimenez, the village magistrate, was a man of immense cruelty and sharp observation. Canon despised the fringes of his territory and despised Widow Morales even more for refusing his advances after her husband's passing. "Feeding a small army, Widow Morales?" Canon asked one morning in the market square, his gloved hands resting on the pommel of his sword. His narrow, calculating eyes scanned her sled. 3 sacks of flour and an entire side of beef. "Your goats must be developing quite the appetite." "Winter is long, my lord," Githa replied smoothly, keeping her gaze lowered in a show of feigned submission. "I am simply preparing for the worst of the storms." "See that you do," Canon sneered. "The woods are dangerous lately, terrible howling at night. Some say the demons of the forest are restless. It would be a shame if my guards had to burn the woods and everything near it to keep the village safe." Githa hurried home, her heart pounding against her ribs. Her situation was already precarious, but the true danger of her reality revealed itself on the night of the full moon. As the pale light filtered through the cracks in her wooden shutters, the cottage descended into chaos. The children, previously babbling and playing, suddenly fell silent. Little Tobias dropped to his hands and knees, his spine arching violently. Githa watched in absolute terror as the boy's skin rippled. Coarse dark fur erupted along his arms, his jaw elongated, and within moments a small, heavily muscled wolf pup stood in his place. Around the room, the other children followed suit. The twins shifted into smaller, fluffy russet pups, while even the infant Clara grew patches of silver fur, her cries turning into high-pitched yips. Githa backed against the wall, sliding down to the floor. She was harboring werewolves. The legends her grandfather had whispered about the shapeshifters of the northern mountains were real. If the church found out, or if Canon discovered the truth, they would all be burned at the stake. A tiny wet nose nudged her trembling hand. Tobias, in his pup form, whined softly, resting his heavy furry head against her knee. He looked up at her, those golden eyes filled with an all-too-human fear. The Devani formation fell apart. Two Lural were walked off the floor after near hits from their own bounce-back. And Lane 4 kept logging clean hits, one after another, into a system that had never been asked to count this fast for one shooter. By the 8-minute mark, the screen stopped warning me and started doing something else. A soft, repeating tone. It did not sound like an alert. It sounded like a question, like the range itself was asking me to explain what it was seeing. I could not. I watched her work, and I felt the floor of my certainty give way. She was not lucky. Luck does not repeat 24 times. She had done this before on some world that taught hands to move while eyes stayed on the threat. She knew the jewel rating before I said it. She knew the gap timing better than the people who tuned the panels. The range I built to punish the careless had met someone it could not touch. And it was the range that broke first. By the 20-minute mark, she had fired 48 rounds. Then she stopped. She set the gun on the lane barrier. She set down the loader. She asked about the airflow. The last drone hung 3 meters over her head, fully charged, sensors hot. For 6 seconds, it searched for a live weapon and a threat. It found a person standing still with empty hands and a calm face. So it made the only call its code aloud. It read her as harmless and shut itself down. The room held its breath. The gap runs about 1/5 of a second, she said, not loud at all. Is that the factory setting? Or has it drifted? I did not answer for 4 seconds. My people have a word for the moment your map of the world stops matching the world. It means more or less, the lights are still on, but the building has moved. I was standing inside that word, and already I knew I would go back to the data that night and hunt for the math error I would never find. The next morning, the doctrine committee met without notice. The session ran 38 minutes. By the start of the next cycle, a change went out to every range instructor on the station. Section 7 no longer called ballistic fire categorically inefficient. It now read, method dependent on the skill of the shooter. No one signed the change. It sat in the manual as if it had always been there. 2 days later, I filed my own request. I asked that human cadets be moved out of historical methods familiarization and into real kinetic instruction. It was approved in 6 hours. I did not go to the approval meeting. I was at the console running the lane data for the 3rd time. 6 weeks on, they moved the loader. It went down to sublevel 3, to the long hall of glass cases where the Academy keeps tools of note in the history of galactic combat. They set it in case 7C under one narrow light that caught the brass at a low angle. The card beneath it named it Human Loading Device Brass 8 Chamber recovered from Lane 4. The classification line had been crossed out and rewritten from obsolete to precision gap instrument. A last note said the cadet had asked for it back, and the request was denied. I went down on a cycle when the hall was empty. The only sound was the air system, which I noticed was moving very well now. Clean and quick and quiet, the way it had not been the morning she arrived. I thought about the gap she read better than my engineers. I thought about 8 rounds dropping home in a 1.5 seconds while her eyes never left the lane. I thought about the world that must have taught a child what 1/5 of a second costs. I had built a range that forgives nothing. I was starting to think she had never once asked it to. I left without killing the light. Behind me, the old brass took the beam and held it, and would not give it back. The king's loyalists knew we could not protect the pups within the castle walls, Richard whispered, his eyes dimming. We smuggled them out. brought them to the one human the king believed would not slaughter them. The heirs. Heirs. Githa looked toward the cellar door, her stomach plummeting. Tobias, Richard breathed out. He is King Henrik's eldest son, the crown prince. You hold the future of our entire race in your cellar. Richard did not survive the night. Githa buried him beneath the frozen earth behind her cottage, wrapping him in a fine wool blanket, her mind reeling with the weight of her reality. She wasn't just running an orphanage. She was the sole guardian of a royal dynasty in exile. Her newfound, terrifying reality was violently interrupted the following morning. Loud, rhythmic pounding shook her front door. Before Githa could unlatch it, the door was kicked open. Lord Canon Jimenez strode in, flanked by 4 heavily armed guards. "Good morning, Widow Morales," Canon said, his lips curling into a predatory smile. He kicked a stray wooden block left by little William. "My guards reported seeing a man dragging himself toward your property last night. We are here to ensure you haven't taken in any dangerous fugitives." Githa's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced her face into a mask of placid confusion. "A man, my lord? I saw no one. The wind was so loud I barely heard my own goats." "Is that so?" Canon stepped further into the cottage, his eyes darting around. He noticed the excessive number of blankets piled near the hearth. "You live alone, yet you have enough bedding for a large family." "I spin wool to sell in the spring, my lord," she lied smoothly. Canon's eyes narrowed. He began pacing the small room. "There are rumors, Githa. Rumors of a woman, beasts in the woods. Rumors of a woman dealing in dark magic, harboring creatures of the devil. A rogue faction of wolves in the north has offered a very lucrative bounty for a missing royal pup. A golden-eyed beast." Githa froze. Canon knew. He wasn't just a corrupt magistrate. He was colluding with the rogue werewolves who were hunting the children. Suddenly, a muffled sneeze echoed from beneath their feet. The room fell dead silent. Canon slowly looked down at the wooden floorboards, then back up at Githa, his smile widening into something monstrous. "What do you keep in your cellar, widow?" Canon asked, drawing his long sword. The metallic shing sounded like a death knell in the cramped cottage. "Potatoes," Githa said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, her hands slowly reaching behind her back toward the heavy iron blacksmithing hammer resting on the counter. "And I would ask you not to disturb them. Let's check on your harvest, shall we?" Canon mocked, gesturing for his guards to rip up the trapdoor. Just as a guard's hand grasped the iron ring of the cellar door, an unearthly, deafening roar shook the very foundation of the cottage. It wasn't the howl of a normal wolf. It was a sound of pure, concussive dominance that shattered the frost-covered windows. Outside, the tree-line erupted. A beast the size of a warhorse, coated in midnight black fur and dripping with melting snow, crashed into the front yard. The creature's eyes burned like twin suns, radiating absolute authority. King Henrik Osborne had come for his children. Shattered glass rained down like jagged diamonds as the massive black wolf breached the cottage window. The sheer kinetic force of his entry sent the heavy oak dining table crashing into the stone hearth, splintering the wood into kindling. Lord Canon Jimenez stumbled backward, his arrogant sneer vanishing, replaced by absolute, paralyzing dread. The guards did not stand a chance. King Henrik Osborne moved with a fluidity that defied his colossal size. With a single swipe of his massive clawed paw, the first guard was thrown against the far wall unconscious before he even hit the floorboards. The second and third guards dropped their long swords, scrambling for the open doorway, but the Alpha King intercepted them with a deafening, chest-rattling snarl that forced them to their knees in sheer terror. Githa remained pressed against the kitchen counter, her fingers wrapped in a death grip around the handle of her husband's heaviest iron-forging hammer. She watched in awe and terror as the beast defended her home. However, as the black wolf turned its burning golden eyes toward Canon, a violent tremor racked its massive frame. The beast stumbled, its hind legs briefly giving out. The dark, unnatural poison Richard had spoken of was ravaging the king's nervous system, severely restricting his regenerative abilities. Canon, noticing the momentary weakness, desperately unclasped a hidden sheath at his hip. He drew a wicked curved dagger, its blade glistening with a thick, sickly green paste. "Die, you mongrel!" Cannon screamed, lunging forward with a coward's desperation. He drove the poisoned dagger deep into the soft spot between the wolf's heavily muscled shoulder and neck. A sound of pure agony tore from the beast's throat. Henrik thrashed, snapping his jaws, but the concentrated wolfsbane immediately entered his bloodstream. The great black wolf collapsed onto the wooden floorboards, his breathing turning into a wet, ragged wheeze. Cannon stood over the fallen king, laughing hysterically, raising his steel long sword to sever the Alpha's head. He never completed the swing. Stepping silently from the shadows of the kitchen, Githa swung the 20-pound iron blacksmithing hammer with every ounce of strength her hard life had afforded her. The heavy iron head connected squarely with the back of Cannon's skull. A sickening crunch echoed through the cottage. The corrupt magistrate dropped like a stone, his sword clattering harmlessly away from the dying king. Githa did not pause to process the violence. She immediately dropped the hammer and rushed to the king's side. As she fell to her knees, the massive black wolf began to violently shudder. His thick fur receded. His bones cracked and reformed in a grotesque symphony of shifting anatomy, and within moments a man lay on her floor. King Henrik Osborne was breathtaking, even at death's door. He possessed a sharply angled jaw, a mane of dark, sweat-dampened hair, and a muscular torso marred by years of warfare and rebellion. But the sickly green veins spider-webbing outward from the stab wound demanded immediate attention. "Why, stay with me," Githa commanded, her voice surprisingly steady. She grabbed her heaviest wool blankets, frantically covering his exposed form to stave off the biting winter chill. Henrik's golden eyes fluttered open, locking onto her. They were filled with an ancient, exhausting weight. "The children," he rasped, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone that sent an involuntary shiver down her spine. "They are safe," she assured him, running to her apothecary cabinet. She retrieved her most potent remedies, rapidly gathering her supplies, dried yarrow to staunch the weeping wound, activated charcoal from the hearth to bind the poison, crushed willow bark to ease the excruciating pain of the wolfsbane, a vial of distilled spirits to cleanse the contaminated flesh. Working with frantic precision, Githa cleaned the wound, ignoring the way Henrik's powerful muscles tensed under her touch. She applied the charcoal and yarrow, binding his shoulder tightly with fresh linen. "You are Githa," he whispered, watching her meticulously save his life. "And you are bleeding on my clean floors, your majesty," she replied dryly, though her hands trembled slightly as she wiped the cold sweat from his forehead. "I suppose I should curtsy, but I am currently busy keeping your heart beating." A faint, strained chuckle rumbled in his chest. Richard chose well. Once the king was stabilized and resting near the roaring fire, Githa careful. Once the king was stabilized and resting near the roaring fire, Githa carefully unlocked the heavy cellar doors. One by one, the pups cautiously climbed the wooden stairs. The moment little Tobias, still in his russet wolf pup form, sniffed the air, he let out a joyful, high-pitched yip. The pup bounded across the room, shifting into a naked 3-year-old boy mid-leap, and crashed into Henrik's uninjured side. The imposing Alpha King wrapped his massive arms around his heir, burying his face in the boy's dark hair. Tears, hot and unrestrained, spilled from the king's golden eyes. Githa watched from the kitchen, a profound warmth blossoming in her chest. She had spent 3 years feeling utterly alone in a cold, unforgiving world. Now, looking at the fierce, broken king and the children she had sworn to protect, she realized she had accidentally forged a family. But the peace was a fragile illusion. Cannon was dead, but the rogue faction hunting the royal heirs was still very much alive. Winter gave way to a treacherous freezing rain over the next 5 days. Henrik's recovery was painstakingly slow due to the residual poison in his system, but the time spent in the cramped cottage forged an unbreakable bond between the king and the widow. Githa cooked, tended to his wounds, and kept the boisterous children entertained. In return, Henrik watched her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. He admired her resilience, her sharp wit, and the fearless way she scolded his feral pups when they chewed on her knitting needles. One evening, as the children slept soundly in a tangled pile of limbs and fur near the hearth, Henrik slowly pushed himself up from his chair. He walked over to where Githa was washing wooden bowls in a basin. He stood close, too close, his broad chest almost brushing her back. "You have given me back my soul, Githa," Henrik murmured, his deep voice vibrating through the quiet room. She turned around, suddenly trapped between the counter and the towering Alpha. She looked up into his mesmerizing golden eyes. "I only did what any decent woman would do." "No," Henrik corrected gently, reaching out to tuck a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His rough fingertips lingered on her cheek, sending a jolt of electricity straight to her core. "You did what an alpha would do. You protected the innocent against impossible odds. You possess a heart rarer than any gemstone in my kingdom." Before Githa could respond to the intoxicating proximity, Henrik's head snapped toward the heavy wooden door. His golden eyes flared, his pupils dilating wildly. The romantic tension vanished instantly, replaced by lethal predatory instinct. "They are here," he growled, stepping in front of her. Outside, the heavy freezing rain masked the sound of approaching footsteps, but Henrik's enhanced senses detected them. A low, mocking howl echoed through the valley, followed by a voice that dripped with aristocratic malice. "Brother," the voice called out from the darkness. "I see you have found a cozy little hovel to die in." Henrik's jaw clenched. "Arthur, my traitorous kin." He allied with the corrupt Duke Philip Beaufort to fund his coup, supplying the rogues with silver weaponry in exchange for northern logging territories. Githa peered through the crack in the wooden shutters. Torches illuminated the treeline. At least 50 heavily armed men and massive snarling werewolves surrounded her property. Arthur Osborne stood at the forefront, holding a torch, his own eyes burning a sick, corrupted yellow. "I cannot fight 50 men and wolves in this weakened state," Henrik admitted, his voice tight with frustration. He turned to Githa, his expression desperate. "I will shift and draw them away into the woods. You must take the children and flee south toward the coast." "Absolutely not," Githa snapped, her eyes flashing with sudden fierce defiance. "I did not spend the last month raising 5 destructive wolf pups and keeping you from bleeding out just to watch you commit suicide in my front yard." Henrik stared at her, stunned. "Githa, this is not a negotiation." "I am the healer of Oak Haven, Henrik," she interrupted, rushing toward her apothecary cabinet. "I know botany and I know chemistry. I know exactly what happens when you combine raw wolfsbane, sulfur, and damp nightshade over an open flame." She began furiously grinding the toxic plants in her mortar, mixing them with the heavy black powder she used to clear tree stumps from her fields. "When I throw this into the hearth, it will create a massive pressurized cloud of toxic smoke," Githa explained, moving with frantic efficiency. "It will billow out of the chimney and the windows. It won't kill them, but the concentrated wolfsbane vapor will temporarily paralyze the rogues and blind the humans." Henrik smiled, a terrifying predatory grin spreading across his face. "A tactical genius. You will leave them entirely defenseless." "Exactly," Githa said, handing him a wet cloth. "Cover your face. The moment the smoke hits them, you strike." She tossed the heavy, volatile mixture directly into the roaring flames. The reaction was instantaneous. A deafening whoosh echoed through the cottage as a thick, violently purple smoke erupted from the fireplace. Githa threw open the front door and the windows. The freezing wind caught the dense toxic cloud, driving it forcefully outward into the yard where Arthur and his army waited. Chaos erupted instantly. The rogue wolves began coughing violently, dropping to the ground as their limbs seized from the potent airborne wolfsbane. The human mercenaries, blinded and choking on the noxious fumes, dropped their weapons in a panic, rubbing their burning eyes. Henrik did not hesitate. Tearing the wet cloth from his face, he bounded through the open doorway, shifting midair. The great black wolf crashed into the enemy ranks like a god of war. Despite his residual weakness, Henrik was fueled by the righteous fury of a father defending his young. He tore through the mercenaries, his massive jaws crushing their silver weapons. He singled out Arthur, who was kneeling in the mud, gagging on the toxic smoke. The duel was brutal but short. Arthur, stripped of his unfair advantages, was no match for the true Alpha King. With a final sickening crunch, Henrik pinned his traitorous brother to the frozen earth, his massive teeth sinking into Arthur's shoulder, forcing the rogue into whimpering submission. The remaining rebels, witnessing the fall of their leader, fled into the night, abandoning their coup. Silence slowly returned to the Oak Haven Valley, broken only by the crackling of the hearth and the gentle patter of freezing rain. Henrik shifted back into his human form, breathless and covered in mud, but victorious. He walked back into the cottage where Githa stood surrounded by the 5 children, her iron hammer still clutched in one hand. The king dropped to one knee before the human widow. Arthur will face the High Council's justice, and the rebellion is broken, Henrik declared, his golden eyes locked intensely on hers. My kingdom is secure once more. I am taking my heirs home. Githa felt a sudden sharp pain in her chest. She lowered the hammer, her throat tight. I understand. I will pack their things. You misunderstand me, Githa, Henrik said softly. He reached out gently, taking her calloused hand in his large, warm one, pressing a reverent kiss to her knuckles. A kingdom is nothing without its heart. These children look to you as their mother. And I. He paused, his voice thick with raw emotion. I look to you as my equal, my mate. Come back to the capital with us. Rule by my side. Githa stared at him, tears welling in her eyes, as little Tobias hugged her leg tightly. She looked at the humble cottage that had been her prison of grief, and then at the fierce, devoted king offering her the world. She smiled, wiping a tear from her cheek. Only if I can bring my goats. Henrik threw his head back and laughed, a rich, joyous sound that chased the last of the winter shadows away. You shall have a royal herd, my queen. From the ashes of a lonely widow's life, a new dynasty was forged. Githa Morales left Oak Haven not as a humble peasant, but as the fiercely beloved queen of the Osborne pack, proving that true power did not come from a bloodline, but from a heart willing to open its doors to the lost. Did this thrilling tale of romance, royal secrets, and fiercely protective wolves capture your heart? Githa's courage proves that true strength lies not in claws or crowns, but in a mother's unwavering love and a ruler's devoted soul. If you love this medieval shifter drama, hit that like button, share this video with your fellow fantasy lovers, and subscribe to our channel for more epic werewolf stories. Don't forget to ring the bell so you never miss an adventure.